Well, on your screen now on Book TV is a well-known face for C-SPAN viewers. That's Mary Frances Berry. She is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's also the author of several books. We're at the University of Pennsylvania today to talk to her about this book, And Justice for All, the United States Commission on Civil Rights and the Continuing Struggle for Freedom in America. Mary Frances Berry, when did the U.S. Civil Rights Commission begin and why?
Well, the Civil Rights Commission started in 1957. President Eisenhower had a lot of discussions with John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, about the way the United States was seen around the world because of a lot of the racism that was going on, that people would hear about and read about. And the fact that there seemed to be a lot of episodes that kept happening, whether it was lynching or some kind of discrimination that was taking place in the country. So that the idea was, Eisenhower said, that he was going to ask Congress to set up a Civil Rights Commission which would put the facts on top of the table. And I'm told by one of the people who was at the meeting that he slammed the table and said, they're going to put the facts on top of the table. And commissions, as we know who do policy, are sometimes set up because there's a tough problem and people don't want to do anything about it. So they set up a commission, they get a report, and it goes away. So, but this commission was supposed to put the facts on top of the table, and then its future would depend on what it found out, how aggressive it was, and what the public thought about what they were doing.
So this was initially set up as relatively a temporary commission.
Right. It was temporary, and it was to deal with race, and it came the year before the Little Rock crisis, and there was all kinds of ferment going on in the country, and Eisenhower, it was to diffuse part of the crisis and present a better image of the country to the world, and if on the way they could recommend some solutions, that would be great.
So who made up the first commission? Who was the chair?
First commission, the idea was to put people on there who would be respected, especially the chairman, somebody who would people think would this person's objective. And they put the chairman, who was the president of Michigan State University over in East Lansing.
White man?
Yes, he was made the president of it. They had one black member, a guy named Wilkins, who was an assistant secretary of labor. And they thought that he was a sort of moderate person. I read all the White House files, by the way. I didn't just serve on the commission, but since I'm a historian, I got all the files from all the presidents, all the White Houses, and read all that stuff so I could see what they were saying inside about what they were doing. And so the one lone black guy who was an advisor in the Eisenhower White House, who mostly was there just to sort of tell them names of people that they could appoint to something that wouldn't get him in trouble. That was his job. He said, this Wilkins guy won't get you in trouble. Name him to it. But the rest of the folks on there, there was a professor. They named Father Ted Hesburgh from Notre Dame, an important figure. So it had important people on it to start out with.
Now, Mary Frances Berry, when did you serve as chair of the Civil Rights Commission?
Well, I came to the Civil Rights Commission in 1980 after having served in the Carter administration running federal education programs and after having been chancellor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where people say I was the first woman to be head of a research, major research university. But in any case, I came and I had big fights with Ronald Reagan because even though I was just a commissioner, I, along with one of my Latino woman who was the only other minority on the commission, Bambi Ramirez, we would dissent whenever the commission tried to do something that was terrible. Well, Reagan appointed some people, so we had some problems. And we had a big fight with him. But I was on there, and I went through all of those fights. Finally, it was Clinton who made me the chair of the commission.
But President Carter appointed you to the
Carter
commission.
appointed me when I left his education, running education. He got a new Department of Education. I went back to teaching, and he appointed me to the commission.
At what point did it become clear that the U.S. Civil Rights Commission would become a permanent agency, in a sense?
After the first year, when the reports that they did, what the commission did was, instead of sitting down and saying, okay, we're just here as a safety valve and we don't really, we'll just serve out of time, they did some hearings. The major power the commission has, and I point this out in the book, and to me it's the most important thing about the commission, when it does what it's supposed to do, it will go out and listen to people that nobody else will listen to. Problems that, civil rights problems that people had, that they could not get anyone to pay attention, not just local people, but the federal government. They would write letters, they would do all kinds of, nobody would pay any attention. The Civil Rights Commission decided that first year they would go out and listen to these people and see what they had to say, and they had the power under the statute to subpoena anyone. Eisenhower said, the reason why I want to get it passed by Congress instead of issuing an executive order is because my Attorney General, Herb Brownell, tells me that's the only way they can subpoena anybody. And given what the problems are, some people may not want to come to testify. So the commission, its most important power was subpoena. And they went in the South, and they looked all over the place to see what the problems were. And they made recommendations that were controversial but seemed to make sense. So after they had been there for a while, it was clear that they needed to be reauthorized and needed to be continued to work on these issues. And then, of course, the Little Rock crisis happened, and the whole civil rights movement started to heat up. So it was clear that there was a need. Then the commission spent the next few years figuring out what to recommend to the government to bring to fruition what these people were protesting about in the streets. In other words, people were protesting and dying and going to jail and so on in the civil rights movement. But what they did is to make recommendations about what legislation would look like that might do something to help alleviate some of these problems.
Professor Berry, just to go back, were all the members originally appointed by President Eisenhower?
The members were appointed by him and confirmed by the Senate. In those days, you had to be confirmed by the Senate.
And
it was bipartisan. Some of the people were Democrats and some were Republicans.
Now, going back to the Mr. Wilkins also, any relation to academic Roger Wilkins of today?
No, he's related instead. It's another whole family, and my dear friend Roger is not related to that family. That family is related to a professor at Harvard whose name is also Wilkins, but it's the Chicago, Illinois Republican Wilkins as opposed to the Democrat Roger Roy Wilkins NAACP line.
Mary Frances Berry, how did the commission change when the Kennedy administration came in, when the Johnson administration came in?
When the Kennedy administration came in, I called that chapter, something about being with friends, among friends, because the commissioners were all saying to themselves, these are good, solid Democrats who are liberals, and they're going to do everything we say needs to be done. Now is the time to get it all done. They didn't know that behind the scenes, Bobby Kennedy, who was I call him the bad Bobby then, not the good Bobby he became later by experience, they were all making fun of the commission. These people keep recommending all this stuff and they think we're going to do this. And it wasn't that they were hostile to civil rights. The problem was that the committees in Congress were controlled by Democrats who were from the South and who were racist. And Eastland from Mississippi and so on, McClellan, they were the people who controlled the Judiciary Committee and everything that happened. And they controlled judicial appointments. Kennedy didn't want to offend them. So that instead of the friendly reception that they thought they would get, they would be listened to, but the administration would try to find, and they would take their recommendations and try to incorporate them later on in legislation once the civil rights movement forced them to. But until the civil rights movement forced them to, they would just simply be polite and say, and then they would write little notes back and forth to themselves about, these people think we're going to do this. We can't do this. We can't do any of this. So they found out, and they tried to cooperate with the administration, but what they found out, it was that the independence that was put into the law when they were set up, which made them an independent voice for civil rights, was really important, and that they shouldn't try to be friendly with some particular administration. Their job was to be a watchdog, as Father Ted Hesburgh was called, be a watchdog over what the administration was doing. And they learned that, and then when Kennedy was assassinated, and Johnson was a pro-civil rights president because of that and because of the civil rights movement, what they proposed as legislation in the Civil Rights Act of '64 and '65 were actually enacted into law.
At what point did you become aware in your life of the Civil Rights Commission?
I became aware of them when I was in a graduate program, university. Someone came to me, I've forgotten who, and asked me if I would work on a project they had. They used to hire consultants and get advisors to do various projects.
Was this 60s, 70s?
Yes, and I then used some of their reports, because the reports they did